Today we'll explore how protesters and their Marxist-Leninist leaders here in America create the semblance of revolution, the final step for communist takeover. You're watching Anarchy in America with Christian Gomez. We've looked at how communists create anarchy in the streets and use violence to incite revolution for communist takeover by first dividing the people, creating the appearance of popular support, neutralizing the opposition, and precipitating mob violence. Now we'll see how communist agitators use anarchy and violence to create the semblance of revolution. According to the Lenin Collected Works, Volume 8, on the subject of revolution, Lenin wrote, "Outbreaks, demonstrations, street fighting, units of a revolutionary army, such are the stages in the development of the popular uprising." Today, we see Lenin's words being put into action by organizations such as Black Lives Matter and Antifa. Our next guest is Mr. William F. Jasper, senior editor for The New American, researcher, author, and anti-communist expert. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure, Christian.
What are some proofs that the current Black Lives Matter organization and movement has ties, or some of its worst ties, rather, to the communist revolution?
Well, Christian, we can look, first of all, at the founders. Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza have come out publicly and said, we're trained Marxists. And that's on video, being interviewed by another leftist revolutionary.
We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
And we see, for instance, the funding of Alicia Garza in her Black Lab is funded by the Chinese Progressive Association, which is wholly a subsidiary of Communist China. They operate closely with the Chinese embassy in New York, the Chinese consulate. The Black Lives Matter is a foreign agent in this country, and that China is directing much of their activities. But if you look at the founders of Black Lives Matter, they are replete with communist propaganda. So you have Angela Davis, who ran for the Communist Party as vice president, one of their official candidate. She was with the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army. So she was a terrorist, broke her lover out of jail, and in the process got a judge and other people killed. So she is now a professor, has been for many years, still a communist, she's a supporter of Joe Biden. She and Jane Fonda, Hanoi Jane Fonda, are big supporters and are out campaigning for Joe Biden, but they're big supporters of Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, hold her up as the icon for BLM, as they also hold up Black revolutionary terrorist Assata Shakur, otherwise her real name, Joanna Chesimard, who is still in Castro's Cuba. She fled the United States after she escaped from prison and went to Fidel Castro's dictatorship. So they promote her. Mumia Abu-Jamal, a communist cop killer, again, another one of the heroes. They are insinuating this into the American culture because they have been given this big platform now, and they're able to propagandize to millions of people and completely rewrite history with all of their propaganda.
So during the 1960s, we saw civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King and John Lewis leading marches linking arm to arm in solidarity of one another in the name of civil rights and justice. Earlier this year, we saw the late Democratic Congressman John Lewis doing the same thing. But in addition to Lewis, we've also seen Republican leaders marching with BLM. For example, back on June 8, 2020 this year, the Washington Post recorded a video of Republican U.S. Senator Mitt Romney marching at a BLM march and expressing his support for BLM.
Hey, Senator, why is it important for you to be out here today? We need a voice against racism. We need many voices against racism and against brutality. We need to stand up and say that Black Lives Matter.
Mr. Jasper, what are the purpose of these marches, and why are men like Romney, the former 2012 Republican presidential candidate, doing at a BLM rally?
What we are witnessing now with the BLM, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa, and they are joined, riots going on all across the country, has nothing to do with racial justice. It has nothing to do with stopping police brutality. It has nothing to do with all the things which they say it is all about bringing about an end to systemic racism. It is all about continuing a revolution which has been ongoing for over a century now in this country. Over a century since the Communist Party was actually formed here in the United States to create revolution, to bring strife between the races. And at the same time, it's a century that we've had the globalists, that is, those who have been financing the big wealthy people like we see today, George Soros, funding Black Lives Matter, working hand in hand to create revolution from above and below, pressure from above, pressure from below. When we see Mitt Romney, a big Wall Street billionaire, marching with them, a so-called Republican, and we see many other Republican leaders doing likewise, there are a number of dynamics there. When it comes to Mitt Romney, we could get into his background. He is a committed globalist, meaning he wants to promote the same globalism that left-wing Democrat George Soros promotes. That's why he has been one of the most vitriolic Republican opponents of President Trump. When it gets to some of these other Republican leaders that march with it, we could just mark many of them down to political opportunism. They see something that appears in the media and want not to be a popular uprising. They want to virtue signal. They want to be woke and to hopefully, they think, gain black votes. So they go and march with Black Lives Matter, which is destroying black hopes and black dreams and black businesses.
Absolutely. What about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? How have they given credence or emboldened BLM and those anarchists that are clamoring for revolution in the streets?
Well, virtually all of the Democratic candidates for president, as well as most of the leading Democratic candidates and incumbents across the country, have been supporting Black Lives Matter. A number of them have even supported Antifa, although there are fewer of them, but virtually none of them have condemned Black Lives Matter, even when it's very obvious that many of their leaders are fully promoting all of the destruction, the rioting, the burning, the arson, and which has even resulted in murder across the country.
So what would you say are the political aims and legislative aims in terms of possible legislation from Congress that BLM and that these various left-wing groups like Antifa and Freedom Road Socialists, Communist Party USA would like to see passed and enacted?
Well, we don't have to speculate. We can, but they've actually put it down in writing, and many of them have had a hand in writing the Democratic platform, the Democratic Party platform. And the Democrat platform and most of the leading Democratic leaders are all on board with the abolishing the police, defunding the police, reparations, so-called, to black people here in this country, meaning transfer of hundreds of billions of dollars, Medicaid for all of the big welfare government programs. So they're trying to keep black people on the plantation, dependent on government, trying to buy votes with that, promising all kinds of new programs for them, as well as things which would seem obviously not in the interests of, or even in the political expectations or concerns of most black people. That is the radical environmental agenda that AOC,
the Green New Deal, for example,
Green
AOC.
New Deal, what are promoting. Biden is all on board with that. Kamala Harris. Actually, Kamala Harris, when she spoke to the NAACP, while Black Lives Matter rioters were burning dozens of cities around the country, she praised Black Lives Matter as brilliant. And she didn't actually, she nor Biden came out and actually condemned rioting and burning until after there was sufficient blowback that they thought, oh, I guess we better distinguish. We are for peaceful demonstrations. For Black Lives Matter, but they would not hold Black Lives Matter or even Antifa to account for those things.
Now, during the Cold War, most Americans understood that the ultimate aim of the international communist movement was for world domination, led out of Moscow with the Soviet Union. So the communist aim was to break apart the U.S. by establishing a sovereign Black or Negro Soviet republic that would be aligned with Moscow, Cuba, and other communist countries. Has this plan changed, or is it still, or has it been brought back?
Yes, it has been brought back. It seemed to have gone into eclipse for about 20 to 30 years since the 1970s. Back in the 1970s, only a few super radical Blacks still continued to push this idea of separating, carving out the Black Gulf states of the United States into a separate Black Belt nation. That, as you pointed out, was actually put forward by the Soviet Union through their puppet organization here, the Communist Party USA. And the principal character that they were using to promote it at that time was Harry Haywood. And he went to Moscow, was trained there, along with Paul Robeson and quite a number of other Black Americans, who some of whom turned
like Robert
against
F. Williams, for example, too.
Like Robert F. Williams. So they were trained in Moscow. They were sent back here, alleging that this was to help Black Americans, but really they wanted to destroy the United States. So that has come back now. And recently I wrote an article on Antifa, Black Lives Matter, where Professor Idris Robinson from Drexel University is just one of the more notable, very vocal proponents of this now. He gave a speech in Seattle during the big CHOP autonomous zone occupation there. And he specifically cited Harry Haywood and the Communist Party and said and advocated bringing back this whole idea of the Black separatist Black nation, where they would take over. It would all be run by people like him, like we saw in Seattle.
And how about other groups? Is the Freedom Road Socialist Organization also pushing for this Black Communist Republic?
Right. So the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and Liberation Road, two connected organizations, are principal proponents of this and have been holding a very important leadership position in many of the riots around the country. And the individual who's done the most research on them, and I agree with him, that's Trevor Loudon, whom you've had on before. He writes for us at the New American. He's an excellent researcher. He says that the Freedom Road Socialist Organization is the spearhead now in Minneapolis, Chicago, Philadelphia, many of these cities, and he points out case by case who these individuals are and the roles that they're playing in this leadership. They are a Maoist, Trotskyist organization. We have the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is a Maoist Chinese communist organization. We have the Workers' World Party, which is another Maoist organization. They call themselves the Trotskyist organization in the United States. So these are all people that have been at the heart of doing violent street demonstrations disguised as peaceful protests for decades.
Now, for those that are watching, could you tell us who Robert F. Williams was and what his role was in the creation of a Black Soviet Republic, at least what he wanted to establish?
During the 1970s, 60s and 70s, Robert F. Williams, who was an associate of Malcolm X and of Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, went super leftist, and he actually left the United States and went to Cuba, where he would operate their radio broadcasts into the United States, calling for violent overthrow of the U.S. government. He published a publication called The Crusader. He championed communist China. This was at a time when Mao Zedong was murdering millions of people. His Cultural Revolution was doing exactly what we see here, only with a little more robustness. They actually were dragging people out, the professors, even leftist communist professors. They weren't far enough to the left. So they were in China, they were dragging them out, lynching them, torturing them, tearing down all the statues, the temples, everything about Confucius or Buddha or anything Christian. So Robert F. Williams, well, he was all on board with that. After he left Fidel Castro's communist dictatorship, he went to communist China. He lived there for many years. He was an honored guest of the communist government there, continued his propaganda, and now it's being resurrected again by the Black Lives Matter and other groups that are promoting revolution in our streets now.
Absolutely. Speaking of revolution in our streets, you were at the riots that happened in Los Angeles in 1993, the Rodney King riots. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw there and how that was essentially being driven or organized by communists even behind the scenes?
Right. Well, we had a very similar circumstance to today. Rodney King was a black man who was stopped by the police. He was an ex-con. He was a drug user, drug dealer. He was high on drugs. We won't go into the whole issue of the beating or whatnot, but he, as a result of the Rodney King video, which showed the police trying to subdue him, beating him, there were riots. And then when the jury and the police commissions that looked into it exonerated the police officers and said that they weren't going to send them to jail. Then we had riots just like we've had here recently. But at the time of the riots, many of the people who were actually leading the riots, the attacks on the police center down there and whatnot, were members of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is a Chinese Communist Party Maoist organization.
Final question, Bill, real quick here. What can and should people that are watching do to stop this communist plot for anarchy and ultimately communism in America?
We have to realize that this is not a racial conflict. This is a communist-directed and globalist-funded effort to divide Americans according to race. And that is a collectivist idea. We're individualists. We believe that everybody should be judged on the content of their character. So what we have to do is not succumb to the race baiting and support those people, particularly those brave minority leaders, the Candace Owens, the Burgess Owens, the various people who are speaking up and who are taking heavy hits from the left for breaking with the dogma.
Absolutely. And of course, for those that are watching out there, you could always go to thenewamerican.com and the John Birch Society to learn more and stay informed about this topic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Bill. We appreciate having you.
My pleasure, Kristen.
For more information about BLM and Antifa revolutions and how they are also waging war on local police, we encourage you to read the October 5th, 2020 issue of the New American magazine, which contains various key articles such as The War on Police from Above and Below by Steve Bias and Antifa, What We Need to Know by William F. Jasper. After reading this issue, consider distributing copies to others in your community, such as the police and sheriff officers, business owners, and fellow like-minded conservatives. Copies can be purchased at thenewamerican.com. A link is in the description. Until next week, God bless.